Hello. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi.
You doing okay?
Yes, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Feeling better?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome.
Please tell me, did I miss the Ballet Folklorico?
Yeah, I actually messaged you from Canvas. I didn't email you. I don't know if you usually read the Canvas messages.
Messages.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Hey, may we'll probably have another event pretty soon, so I'll be
I
sure
hope
to.
so. I hope
Yeah,
so. I apologize.
it
Dang
was a
it.
hit. So I hope you get to see our little ones dance one day.
I would love that. I really would. I know I would.
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
love it.
Yeah. One
No,
day,
I'm
no worries.
sorry.
That's okay.
All
No
right.
worries.
Well, so today we're doing the Great Depression and the New Deal. The Depression hit in 29, and the New Deal pretty much began right off the bat in 32 when Franklin Roosevelt came in as the president. And that is his generic term for it, was a New Deal that he was giving the country. And there was quite a bit that was quite new to it. Um, for instance, right, he uh, he had reform, recovery, and oh, there were three R's: recovery, reform, and oh shoot, I apologize. I used to have them memorized. But
Mhm.
at any rate, when he comes in, right, he has a new philosophy that he brings in with it. It's known as Keynesian economics after Keynes, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. And the premise to it, right, is that the health of an economy depends upon the purchasing power of the average American. That as long as the average American has money and goes out to the market and spends it, then that is a very vital component to keeping the economy healthy. But with Keynes, right, he contended that it is the role of the government to ensure that the average American has purchasing power. And even if the government has to engage in deficit spending, spending money that it doesn't have. So in the short run, the government gets further in debt, but it's supposed to, the expression they use is priming the pump. It primes the pump and gets everything going. And then in the long run, we could worry about getting out of national debt. And of course, right, they called this a war. They called this an emergency. The Depression was huge. There's a guy named Luchtenberg in his book on FDR and the Depression. His intro is just very moving. He talks about people in Chicago uh, fighting each other for the scraps of people's food that was thrown out in the garbage behind the restaurant in the alley. And we're not talking about like people that had been habitually homeless. We're talking about people that were suddenly now without a home. And so, you probably have heard the term, heard the ratio a quarter, but in some places it was much higher than one fourth of the eligible workers out of jobs. There's a place called Toledo, like Toledo, Spain, Toledo, Ohio, a couple places in Michigan with the Henry Ford factories, Dearborn, etc. And so many people were laid off that the numbers got up to above 80%, 80.
Wow.
It's crazy. Like at least 8 out of 10 are without a job. It was insane. Um, and so it changed everything, right? Because we had just experienced the Roaring Twenties, purchasing power for the entire population per capita had gone up. The gross national product had skyrocketed, the value of all the goods that were produced. But now during the Depression, you have all these products that were produced and no official demand to buy them because no one had the money to buy them. So at any rate, and of course the cycle of laying off workers, because you have too high of a supply and not enough of demand, and then that those are just more people out in the market who can't buy your goods, and so then you lay off more, etc. So FDR came in, and in some ways, I think he was just trying to show that 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 he was different, that he cared, um, and that he was at least attempting to get us out of the Great Depression. And so, in doing so, to what extent did he not believe in laissez-faire capitalism, right? Where capitalism is just government, let it be, and stay out of the economy. I don't know. I get differing views on that from different historians. To what extent that he really was kind of on the left and really had like revolutionary ideas and wanted to in a revolutionary manner really change our society and our economy, uh, on a semi-permanent basis. I don't know. It goes back and forth amongst the historians. So, for instance, you have a guy named H.W. Brands, and he's a big historian at the University of Texas, and he adheres to that court image of Franklin Roosevelt, that he was a revolutionary, that he was very ideological, and he wanted to bring in a lot of novelty, etc. And one of the biggest pieces of evidence that he has is in his informal cabinet. Um, he had friends uh, who he went to Harvard with, and they had gone upon the USS Roosevelt, which was named after Teddy, not him, to Europe to see how Europe was dealing with the Depression, and they took notes. So they looked at the fascist countries like Italy and Germany. They looked at the communist countries like the Soviet Union, and they were looking to see what worked and what didn't. And they were pretty open-minded about that, and didn't slow themselves down with ideological opposition and thinking we can't copy anything from communism, we can't copy anything from fascism, etc. So Franklin Roosevelt likely knew they were too radical of choices to be approved by the Senate. So he had them work as his informal cabinet, and they worked with his official choices as cabinet members and tried to pan things out. Uh, and not just that, I mean, some of the programs spoke for themselves as far as being quite revolutionary. So, firstly, right, one of the first things I think of is he knew Americans needed a job. And so he started a public works program or programs, plural. And this had not been done on this scale like ever, nor since. Um, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, everything was an acronym. They had at any given time, Alan Brinkley states, they had 2.5 million people directly employed by the government. Yeah, to do public works. And so, at any rate, and not just public works, he hired people to do art. He hired people to write history. He hired people to act and do theater. Like
So he
there are
just
all
made up
kinds of it.
jobs.
Exactly. He
Yeah.
just wanted to give them jobs. Exactly. He just wanted to give them income, purchasing power. So at any rate, you have the WPA was the biggest one, and then another one was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and with that one, they were young men, young unmarried men, and they put them in military barracks and like wore like military uniforms. They worked with forestry mainly, in different jobs of forestry, and they were because they had their room and board and food paid for by the national government. They were expected to only receive 1/3 of their salary, and 2/3 of it was to go back to their families to give
Oh.
purchasing power to their mom and dad, to their siblings, etc. So I think that is kind of telling of how almost desperately Franklin Roosevelt wanted to give purchasing power to the people. And before that, right, the government would always work with a middleman. You always work with private construction companies, and they hire whom they want. They pay the salaries to whom they want, and do the jobs on behalf of the government. But on these programs, this was just people working directly for the federal government. The machinery, everything was manned and paid for, technically by bureaucrats, by people working directly for the federal government. Yeah. So, especially when the CCC came out with their uniforms, uh, critics contended that they got the color wrong, that they shouldn't have been the khaki color. They should have been black, like the black shirts of Benito Mussolini, or brown, like the brown shirts of Hitler. And so, people saw the corresponding, similarities, and he took a lot of flack for it. Another thing that he did is he bailed people out. He bailed out the banks through the Federal Reserve System, but he made it contingent upon multiple criteria. They could not dabble in the stock market anymore with people's money. They had to cite to the Federal Reserve just how much money they had deposited and how much money they held in capital, and they could only lend out at any given time a certain percentage of that and not lend recklessly like they had in the 20s, lending more money than they had. Um, and through the Lemke Act, Lemke, um, they told banks, if we bail you out, you have to give the people who lost their homes and property, their farms, etc. You have to give them a second shot at a mortgage if we're going to bail you out. So that was pretty cool. A lot of people regained their property through the Lemke Act, and so he had strings tied to things. Also with the what was it the oh Industrial Recovery Act, IRA. Um, he helped out people in the main manufacturing industries. He helped bail them out, and then secondly, he helped them. He allowed them to defy the Clayton Antitrust Act, and he allowed them to uh, make deals with one another about how much of the common product they were going to produce, at what price they were going to do it. So they even engaged in price fixing. And of course, what they were trying to do is they were trying to get demand and supply back in balance. And so he allowed them to defy that. He bailed them out, but in return, right, he demanded what became known as the Wagner Act, Wagner. And Article 7A was known as the blanket code because they said it hit everything. With this Article 7A, let's see here. They did have it here somewhere. These are Works Progress Association. No, this is toward the end. But at any rate, wait, maybe it's right here. Darn it. Well, I'm sorry, it's in here somewhere, okay?
Yeah.
But at any rate, he uh, he made them have a minimum wage. Now, this is a federal level minimum wage. The only thing even close to this in the past had been Woodrow Wilson, and those are only the war industries that were producing things for the war. They had to abide by a minimum wage nationally. But this is much bigger than that, with multiple industries, and they're not at war, etc., right? And so they had to pay a minimum wage. They had to provide workers' compensation if someone were to get hurt. They had to recognize their unions and engage in collective bargaining over the conditions of workers with the union reps. And they had to, those are the main ones. But at any rate, they called it the blanket code, Article Section 7A, because they said it covered everything like a blanket. All right. And so he does that with those strings attached. And then what he also does is he goes to the farmers and he has his bureaucrats meet with the leading producers in the different industries, different crops, and he dictates to them. Now he can't forcefully do it, but what he does, right, is he uses the carrot and the stick. He has ways to punish them with taxation, no subsidization, etc., if they don't comply. And he has ways of subsidizing them if they do comply. But they would tell people how much of their acreage they wanted them to cut down to. to a smaller amount to get the supply down, more in balance with demand. They would tell people to switch crops and go from one agricultural product to another. And so yeah, they did that as well. And initially, the Supreme Court is gonna cut it down and say that the government cannot, interfere with private enterprise to that extent and tell people what to grow and how much of it to grow, etc. And from the little I remember, he changes the name of the act and changes a few things here and there and gets it passed again in another form. So he was quite cunning as well and knew how to take on opposition. And then, of course, symbolically, he had the fireside chats, whereby he would talk to the people and say, it breaks my heart if you didn't have anything to eat today. I want you to know that I went to Congress and told them they need to solve this, this, and that. Um, I want you to know that we're coming out with this program and that program, and we care about you, and we want to put food in your stomach. And so that was pretty big as far as his popularity ratings and so forth. Um, Another thing that he did that was interesting is with his informal and formal cabinet members, right? He would deliberately have them over for dinner, and he would start a debate on a given subject on what to deal with farm products being in such high supply and low demand, right? And they inevitably would have different ideas as to what should be done about it because the actual choice of a cabinet member was usually much more conservative and less radical than his friends were on in his informal cabinet. And he would chuckle and he would say, "You guys can't leave each other until you come up with a compromise of some sort, and until you come up with an idea, and I want to hear about it." So then they would have to compromise, right? And they would come to him with the idea, and then he had regular press conferences, and he would come into the press conferences, and he's one of the only presidents that I've ever read of that actually asked more questions of the journalists than they asked of him. And that might have been very sharp of him because he was always trying to gauge public opinion on one given topic or after another. And so he would throw out the idea that his informal and formal cabinet members had come up with to see what the journalists thought. And in reality, right in the foundation of it, to see what the journalists thought the people would think about that given program. And sometimes, if it seemed too radical, Franklin Roosevelt would back off. And then other times he'd feel encouraged and go through with it. So that guy Luchtenberg, in his book, he says, I don't think he was a cut and dry radical reformer on the left. He said, I think he was just a pragmatist. I think he was just a practical politician. And he had a quote from him saying that he did not choose his informal cabinet buddies because of their leanings to the left or right, but simply because he admired their intelligence and so he didn't think that much through. You know what I mean? Instead of like, hey, okay, people can't stomach people this far to the left, so I'm going to put him as my informal cabinet because my task, my idea, my plans involve much to the left. Uh, the fact that he's bailing out the main institutions of capitalism. He's bailing out the banks. He's bailing out the major industries. He's bailing out the big farmers, etc. Right? That in and of itself is rather conservative. It's like he's trying to save capitalism. The people in Europe are going to fascism to the right or communism to the left, and he's trying to avoid those extremes and just come up with practical solutions to get out of the depression. All right. So anyway, he was an interesting guy. Another thing is you get the impression with him, right, that and I'm trying to think what author is really big on this. I want to say H.W. Brands is because H.W. Brands kind of adheres to that hero's journey paradigm with him that he was that in time and through experiences that Franklin Roosevelt became increasingly a much better human being and a more able politician. But whatever it is, right, according to that narrative, if you buy into it, is that when he was younger, he always got to live off of dad's wealth, even and after his dad died when he was quite young. He got to live off of his dad's wealth. Um, he did a lot of socializing and a lot of partying when he was young. Um, and then the idea is one thing that happens that changes him is marrying Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot of depth to her. Okay. There are just so many different causes that she championed as the first lady. And she was more politically involved, more politically active, I think you could say by far, uh, more so than any previous first lady up to this point. And so they said that she had a way of bringing out depth from a seemingly shallow guy like Franklin Roosevelt, that she could shame him. For instance, one of her first dates with him, she took him to a settlement house, those progressive settlement houses where they
Mm.
take care of the poor immigrants and the homeless. And yeah, that's quite an idea for one of your first dates, right? And so she supposedly wanted to put him on a cause, give him a sense of meaning and purpose and service to humanity. And then of course he contracts polio. Um, and when he was close to 30, he was pretty old for just suddenly contracting it. But at any rate, he got polio and he couldn't walk again. And so, you don't see many pictures because they showed respect to him. It was like a gesture of respect that they didn't take pictures of it. But he was in a wheelchair. And so, at any rate, he went down to Warren Springs, Georgia, and there was a camp for children with polio, and they were given water treatment. But when the camp ended, they all had to go home because they couldn't afford uh, to pay the dues to this private club. So instead, he asked his mom if he could have a certain allotment of his money from his deceased dad, and he bought the place and he opened it up for free to the kids.
Wow.
And so yeah, and so um, they say that with Eleanor and with his degree of suffering, that he became a better human being, a more compassionate person who's going to be more of a kind of paternal, loving paternal figure over the country during this terrible depression. But oftentimes, right, um, you see things when it came to ethnic relations that he oftentimes was just oblivious. He was in his own world, as kind of a WASP man. And so, for instance, Eleanor had a black woman come and sing at the White House. And he said, "Are you sure we want to do that? It's going to really tick off the Southern Democrats," because he was a Democrat. And he said, "I'm going to lose some friends and allies with this." And she said, "It's worth it." He said, "Okay, very well. Go ahead." And so he gave her the go ahead, and she sang at the White House. Although they segregated the audience, of course, when she sang. But at any rate, so when it came to Mexican Americans, he just he didn't have a Mexican American in his cabinet. He didn't, and I'm not trying to make excuses for him, but I'm just saying, like, from the image that I get of him, is that he never had any kind of overt antipathy, any bad feelings toward Mexican Americans. But he just never thought of them. He never thought of them. They weren't much of a thought in his head. And so what happens is when he has these programs and established, is he allows the states and the local governments to carry them out. It's his federal money, right? And he and Congress get to write the guidelines for the programs, but they're carried out at the state and local levels. And supposedly, from some historians, they say because he wanted to pick his battles and he knew that it was just good enough that he was getting these programs passed. And so he was willing to allow the local and state governments to feel like they were a part of this. And they might be less inclined to oppose these programs if they could run them. So at any rate, when he does that, however, It was at the local and state levels where you had such bad prejudice and just outright discrimination. So, like with his federal work programs, uh, most of the states in the South, they segregated the laborers under the WPA. So the black workers worked together, segregated from the white workers, etc. And not to mention, right, it was not open to everybody. He didn't spend that much money in his deficit spending that it was just, anybody and all received a job. He had limitations to his budget that Congress would give him. And so then there was picking and choosing of workers. And so, of course, like here in California, Texas, they were really terrible not to choose Mexican Americans, much less Mexican immigrants, to work in these federal programs. So they became very underrepresented in these programs, these work programs, etc. And then in addition to that, right, is with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, telling the farmers what to farm, how much, this and that, right, with the carrot and the stick, is when they paid farmers not to farm or to change their crop, etc., right? They paid the farm land owner, not the sharecroppers that are renting land from him, certainly not the workers, the seasonal workers who happen to be immigrants, etc., coming and just working for a month and then laid off, etc. And so the money just went to the landowner. And so in Arkansas, the sharecroppers united and formed a powerful union, and they were demanding of President Roosevelt that they get paid as well, not to farm, etc. And he did not. He said that their unionization and their violence, because they had a couple violent episodes in Arkansas, he said it smacked of communism, that they were acting like communists, and so he refused to have them paid. So that's a conservative side to him, just paying the landowners and not the workers. So at any rate, with that, needless to say, most of the Mexican Americans that engaged in farm labor did not own the land that they were working on. So therefore, they did not get paid from the Agricultural Adjustment Act's, administration. So yeah, so you have these types of things going on. Oh, and then also the Industrial Recovery Act. With the Industrial Recovery Act, they did go over a lot of the major industries and bailing them out, like I mentioned, allowing them to fix their supplies, fix their prices, etc. But guess what? That did not include agricultural workers. It did not include canneries and other types of major employers of Hispanic workers. So, you know what I'm saying? It's like Franklin Roosevelt did not overtly go out of his way to discriminate against Mexican Americans. But I would make the subjective argument that they just weren't much of a thought in his head, almost ever. And in having the local and state governments carry the New Deal programs out, it led to their being kind of marginalized, left out, and not helped as much as other demographics during the Great Depression. All right. And then if that's not bad enough, you had segregation in education. You had segregation at public pools and other public establishments like that. And so the Latino people, they tried to engage in boycotts and strikes. They clearly exercised their agency in trying to fight against this segregation, discrimination, and marginalization, being left out. Okay. But as they fought back, it only got worse. There were mass deportations from the US back to Mexico. And look at this. This is crazy to me. Is you have approximately 500,000 Latinos returned to Mexico in the 1930s, as many as 60% of them may have actually been born in the United States. That's crazy. So some of the people who were forcefully deported by virtue of the 14th Amendment, born in one of the states, they're citizens. They're U.S. citizens getting deported. And then also, um, some chose, obviously. They weren't all forcefully deported. Amongst that 60% or so, some of them just got tired of conditions and decided, they had not been born in Mexico, they had not been reared or raised in Mexico, and that's how bad things got, so that they wanted to actually go to Mexico. And then back in Mexico, they had a president, Cardenas, who was kind of sticking it to big business, and it made Mexicans feel kind of proud. One of the major industries he went after was the oil industry. So the foreigners who had oil industries, he forced them to pay, or he forced them to sell their property uh, back to the Mexican government, which is known as expropriation. So he expropriated a lot of foreigners' um, resources, their property. They formed newspapers, like I said, they had boycotts, some of which were successful. And then also they began fighting in the courts under LULAC. We're going to look a little bit more under that soon. The League of United Latin American Citizens. And so it is pretty much the equivalent of the black NAACP. All right, whereby they're going to challenge certain discriminatory statutes in the courts. All right. So you notice I don't mean to be redundant, but you notice I have these different gentlemen. You see there, uh, Rodolfo Acuna, Occupied America. Um, I have Our America by Felipe Ernesto Diaz. Um, you have Harvest of Empire that I try to use as well. These are very well-known Chicano history books. And it's just kind of the same old thing as you do conflict history and show the degree to which and the instances in which they were discriminated against, or they were marginalized, or they were pigeonholed into the proletariat. And then you show their agency on what they tried to do. And of course, when we get into their agency and the power of their decisions and fighting back, uh, you'll be more impressed when we get to the Chicano movement. But this is President Franklin Roosevelt, and these are two young Mexican American kids, I'm assuming. And notice they're barefoot, and it's crazy. It's like the stuff of Grapes of Wrath. All right. So, do you have any questions?
No.
Okay. All right.
Is this our only section this week?
It is.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
Interesting section, by the way.
Well, thank you.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, it's not me. It's the data.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is. It's an interesting topic. It's an interesting time period for sure.
yeah. So during the Great Depression, all the Mexican American immigrants that were here, most of them decided to go back to Mexico just because the economy was that bad, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
I
that's
think it's safe
very
to say that.
interesting. Yeah,
It
yeah.
is. Yeah.
Wow.
So then the next topic we'll do is World War II, and how fun is that?
Yeah.
All right. But again, and I mean this, I am so sorry for missing that. I promise you, when I think about it, it is my loss because I know I would have loved seeing that.
Yeah, no worries. Like I said, usually we do have more events coming up. We try to have the little ones perform as much as we can.
Yeah.
Um, so usually when they practice a certain dance, they show it, and that was our first event of the year. So I'm pretty sure there will be more.
All right.
Hmm. Yeah,
I
of course.
can't wait. All right. Well, thank
Alrighty.
you, hon. I hope you
Of
have a good
course.
day and a good week. Okay. If you don't mind, I'm
Thank
gonna go ahead
you.
and let you go. But take care. Okay.
Alrighty, thank you, you too. Have a
All
good
right.
one.
Thanks, son. You
Thanks,
too.
thanks, sir. I
Oh,
joined a little
Dominic,
bit
hi.
late and I missed half of it. Will you have recording up?
Yes, sir.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Kid
Thank you,
stuff. I'm
Dominic,
sure you
for
understand.
thank you for
Thank
saying
you.
something.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Have a good day.
I appreciate it. Bye bye.
Bye bye.